good day. I come a little bit differently today because as I'm beautifully sitting by this river, felt like I should share in some of the readings of which I've been studying as of lately. And I'll see how long I can last out here because I do want to get far. However, I also recognize that mosquitoes like the flavor of my blood. So I just covered myself with some citronella and some chamomile, which I've found in the past have helped me greatly. However, I'm not necessarily, I'm not stuck staying in this area if need be. But I've been reading this book so far called Spontaneous Healing by Dr. Andrew Weil. And I've found that I really have been enjoying some of his studies. He's a classically trained doctor. However, once he got into receiving his certification degree from Harvard Medical School, he decided that he did not want to, or he did not aspire to stay in that frame of practice, because he realized that he was more so operating from prescribing medications and remedying the symptoms that were causing issues to people over actually getting to the root of the cause and being more of a preventative nature. So I've pursued integrative healthcare certifications in the past, and he's been someone that I've studied even before I went down that route of actually looking for certification. And I just wanted to share some of his works with you. I hope this comes to you from a restorative place and that this brings some healing to your mind and gives you hope for a better future. Whoever crosses this book, I pray that it actually gives you some resolve and inspires you for the future. So let's begin. Chapter 1. Prologue in the Rainforest. Let me take... This one feels like I'm not going to do this from my face. Let me start this one over. Set the scene a little bit. Prologue in the Rainforest. Let me take you to a faraway place I visited more than 20 years ago. The sandy bank of a wide river on a sultry afternoon in 1972. The river was a tributary of the Rio Coqueta in the northwest Amazon, near the common border of Colombia and Ecuador, and I was lost. I was searching for a shaman, a Kofan Indian named Pedro, who lived in a remote hut somewhere in the huge, dense forest. But the trail that was supposed to take me there was left me at an uncrossable river with no sign of how to proceed. It was getting late in the day. 2 days before, after a long, hard drive, I left my Land Rover at the end of a dirt road and took a motorboat to a tiny frontier settlement where I spent a restless night. The next day, I found some Indians who took me by canoe to the beginning of a trail they said would eventually bring me to the clearing where Pedro lived. Half a day's walk, they told me. But I knew that half a day's walk for an Indian might be more for me. I had a backpack with essentials, but not much food, since I expected to be staying with the shaman. After several hours in the dark forest, the trail forked. No one had said anything about a fork. I listened to the whisper of intuition and decided to go to the right. After another hour, I came upon a clearing with several huts and 5 Kofan men painting each other's faces. I was terribly hot and thirsty and asked in Spanish for water. The men ignored me. I asked again. They said they had no water. No water, I exclaimed. How can that be? They shrugged and continued to apply their makeup. I asked for the shaman. Not here, said one of the Indians. Where can I find him? There was an offhanded indication of a trail beyond the huts. Is it far? I asked. Another shrug. This was a new experience for me. In the hinterlands of Colombia, I had always found Indians to be exceedingly hospitable. It was the inhabitants of the rough frontier towns, the mestizo fortune hunters, who were unfriendly and intimidating. Once I passed through them to Indian territory, I always felt safe, assured that the native people would take in a stranger, help him find his destination, and certainly give water to a thirsty traveler. The 5 Profan men were young, handsome, and obviously vain. They wore simple cotton tunics, had long, glossy black hair, and were intently devoted to their cosmetic art. After one would apply new markings to forehead or cheek, the recipient would spend long minutes evaluating the additions in a broken piece of mirrored glass, grunting approval or requesting further embellishment. This was clearly going to take all afternoon. My presence held not the slightest interest for them, and after a half an hour of being ignored, I put on my pack and continued down the trail, until several hours later it disappeared into a dense thicket at the edge of the big river, leaving me stranded. It was strikingly beautiful there, although I was inclined to view the river and forest more as obstacles than as sources of sensory pleasure. The big billowy cumulus clouds floated above the canopy of trees. The river was swift and clear. There was not a sign of human presence, no sounds except for those of insects and birds. Were it not for the sandflies, small biting pests that came out in great numbers from dawn to dusk, I would not have minded camping there. I had a hammock and a mosquito net in my pack, and I could have spent the night if necessary, but I felt anxious at the prospect of being lost and discouraged by the fruitlessness of my quest. This shaman, so difficult to reach, was said to be a powerful healer. In a year I spent wandering in South America, most of the shamans I met were disappointing. Some were drunks, some were clearly out for fame and fortune. One, when he learned that I was a doctor from Harvard, was only interested in persuading me to obtain for him a certificate from the institution testifying to his powers, so that he could one-up his rivals. I had plenty of adventures during those travels, but in the end, none of them had taught me how to become a better doctor. Pedro was my last hope. He was unknown to the outside world. I would be the first gringo to visit him, and I had high hopes that he would teach me the secrets of healing I had so long been searching for. But now I was lost, and the brilliant Amazon sun was taking on rich golden tones at the end of afternoon. Night would come quickly here, meaning surprising chilliness along the river and no chance of reaching a habitation. I lit up 3 cigarettes at once. Piel Rojas, Redskins, the local cheat brand, with a picture of a North American Indian in full war bonnet on the pack. I puffed on them and blew smoke all around me, hoping for some temporary relief from the sandflies. When in doubt, eat. I broke into my meager stores and found a packet of cocoa mix and some dried fruit. I set up a little butane stove, boiled some river water, and soon was sipping on the hot liquid, which never tasted better. A bit of comfort and familiarity in this, for me, strange environment. I was in the remote part of South America because I was searching for something I believed to be exotic and extraordinary, something worlds away from my ordinary experience. I was looking for insight into the source of healing power and the interconnectedness of magic, religion, and medicine. I wanted to understand how the mind interacts with the body. Above all, I hoped to learn practical secrets of helping people to get well. I had spent 8 years in a prestigious institution of higher learning, 4 studying botany and 4 studying medicine, but I had found no clear answers to my questions. My botanical studies awakened a desire to see the rainforest, meet native practitioners, and to help rescue fast disappearing knowledge of medicinal plants. My medical training made me want to flee from the world of invasive technological treatment towards a romantic ideal of natural healing. 3 years before, in 1969, when I finished my basic clinical training, I made a conscious decision not to practice the kind of medicine I had just learned. I did so for 2 reasons. one emotional and one logical. The first was simply a gut feeling that if I were sick, I would not want to be treated the way that I had been taught to treat others, unless there was no alternative. That made me uncomfortable about treating others. The logical reason was that most of the treatments that I had learned in 4 years at Harvard Medical School and one of internship did not get to the root of disease processes and promote healing, but rather suppress those processes or merely counteracted the visible symptoms of disease. I had learned almost nothing about health and its maintenance, about how to prevent illness, a great omission, because I have always believed that the primary function of doctors should be to teach people how not to get sick in the first place. The word doctor comes from the Latin word for teacher. Teaching prevention should be primary. Treatment of existing disease, secondary. I am uneasy about the suppressive nature of conventional medicine. If you look at the names of most popular categories of drugs in use today, you will find that most of them begin with the prefix anti. We use antispasmodics, antihypertensives, anti-anxiety agents and antidepressants, antihistamines, antiarrhythmics, antitussives, antipyretics, and anti-inflammatories, as well as beta blockers and H2 receptor antagonists. This is truly anti-medicine. Medicine, that is, in essence, counteractive and suppressive. What is wrong with that, you may ask? If a fever is in the danger zone or an allergic reaction is out of control, of course those symptoms should be counteracted. I have no objection to use of these treatments on short-term basis for the management of very severe conditions. But I came to realize early in my hospital days that if you rely on such measures as the main strategy for treating illness, you create two kinds of problems. First, you expose patients to risk because by their nature, pharmaceutical weapons are strong and toxic. Their desired effects are too often offset by side effects, by toxicity. Adverse reactions to the counteractive drugs of conventional medicine are a great black mark against the system, and I saw more than enough of them in my clinical training to know that there has to be a better way. Botanical medicine appealed to me because it offered the possibility of finding safe, natural alternatives to the drugs I had just been taught to use. The second problem, less visible but more worrisome, is the chance that over time suppressive treatments may actually strengthen disease processes instead of resolving them. This possibility did not occur to me until I read the writings of the great medical heretic Samuel Hahnemann, born 1755 and passing away in 1843. The German prodigy and renegade physician who developed homeopathy, one of the major schools of alternative medicine. Homeopathy relies on very small doses of highly diluted remedies to catalyze healing responses. I am not a homeopath. I disagree with some key points of homeopathic theory, its opposition to immunization, for example, and find the system as a whole puzzling, as well as incompatible with current scientific models of physics and chemistry. Nonetheless, I have experienced and observed homeopathic cures and admire the system for its use of treatments that can not harm. What is more, I find some of Hahnemann's ideas useful. One of his most important teachings concerns the dangers of suppressing visible symptoms of illness. Hahnemann used the example of an itching red rash on the skin. Better to have a disease on the surface of the body, he taught, because from the surface it can exit outward. Suppressive measures may drive a disease process inward towards more vital organs. The itching rash may disappear, but worse troubles may appear down the road, trouble that may resist the strongest suppressive treatments. Hahnemann had this insight long before the discovery of corticosteroids, the very powerful anti-inflammatory hormones that conventional doctors now dispense without much thought for the harm they can do. Topical steroids are very effective suppressants of skin rashes. and are now even sold over the counter in the United States. Again and again, I see patients who become dependent on them as long as they use the steroid creams and ointments. Their rashes are held in check, but as soon as the treatment is stopped, the symptoms reappear more severely than before. The disease process is not resolved, but merely held at bay, gathering power for renewed expression as soon as the outside counteractive force is removed. When steroids are given systemically, their suppressive power and toxicity is even greater. Patients who take drugs like prednisone for months or years to control rheumatoid arthritis, asthma, and other autoimmune and allergic disorders commonly suffer terrible toxicity, weight gain, depression, ulcers, cataracts, weakened bones, acne, etc., but cannot stop taking the drugs because their symptoms will return in full force. What happens to the energies of such suppressed diseases? Where do they go? Right on. My experience with patients confirms Hahnemann's warning. Recently, I saw a woman in her mid-30s who, 2 years before, had developed symptoms of a serious autoimmune disease, scleroderma. The disease began with episodes of painful blanching of the hands on exposure to cold. This is Raynaud's phenomenon, a sign of neurovascular instability that can exist by itself or herald deeper disturbances of nervous and circulatory function. In this case, it was followed by joint pain and swelling of the fingers. Then the skin of her fingers and hands began to thicken and harden, the classic visible manifestation of scleroderma. The word means hard skin. The hands of patients with advanced scleroderma are often cold, purplish, shiny, hard, and immobile. But this external change, while disfiguring, is not the worst effect of this disease. When scleroderma involves internal organs of the digestive and cardiorespiratory systems, it can kill. Doctors quickly diagnosed the problem and started the patient on high doses of prednisone and other immunosuppressive drugs. She responded dramatically. Within a few months, her skin returned to normal, all joint pain disappeared, and her physician pronounced her to be in complete remission. Unhappily, a year later, she developed shortness of breath. X-rays revealed pulmonary fibrosis, a progressive disease in which normal lung tissue is replaced by abnormal fibrous tissue. She was told that this condition was not related to the previous scleroderma, but in fact pulmonary fibrosis is a well-known, albeit uncommon, manifestation of the same process, only in a much more vital area of the body and much more resistant to treatment. Her hands were warm, pink, and soft. There was no visible sign of disease on the surface of her body. Inside, however, she was being crippled by a disease in her lung that now resisted all counteractive power of conventional medicine. By the time I completed my medical internship, I had seen enough variations on this theme to convince me that I did not want to practice conventional medicine or take any further training in it. I did not know what else to practice, however, and that uncertainty led me to undertake my present quest. But after 2 difficult years of searching, I had learned little about healing. Shortly before coming to Kofan territory, I had concluded that I must not have made sufficient effort to explore new terrain. The healers and shamans I had located were already discovered, too well known, too easy to find. What I was looking for must still be further away. I thought, still harder to reach, more obscurely hidden in the Amazon forest. And so there I was, cocoa finished, day coming to an end, lost. I did eventually find Pedro the shaman, and I remember our meeting very well, even though it happened so long ago, because it was a major turning point in my life. Of course, at the time I had no idea of its real significance, regarding it as just another long series of frustrations. In fact, it was the first step of a new path, one that would take me back to a place where I would discover what I had known all along, but had been unrecognizable. Having packed up my equipment and shouldered my pack, I noticed a sandbar a short distance upriver. I thought that from its vantage point, I might get a better view of the area and be able to make an educated guess as to the direction of Pedro's hut. I waded to the sandbar, and as I scanned the shore, I spied what looked like a little bit like a trail farther upstream. It was, and I got to it by walking at just the water's edge, and once on it, felt my anxieties melt away, even as the sun got low in the west. After 45 minutes, I came to a clearing where a small river entered a big one. At the junction, elevated on stilts, was a long, thatched hut of ample size. I ran up to it just as the sky was blazing with the colors of a tropical sunset, and climbed a rude staircase up to a deck overlooking the confluence of the rivers. There was no shaman in sight. The only inhabitant was a young Indian girl who spoke Spanish hesitantly and looked at me as I might with an extraterrestrial. She told me that Pedro was gone. He had left 10 days ago and should have been back the day before. I asked if I could stay. She did not object, so I took off my pack and strung my hammock between two poles at the end of the deck. For the next 4 days and nights, I stayed mostly in my hammock, the El Roja cigarettes blazing in my fingers, watching the long hot days pass into clear starry nights. Occasionally, I would have braved the sandflies to go for an afternoon swim in the river. I tried unsuccessfully to engage the young woman of the house in conversation, and I sought refuge from the world of heat, humidity, blinding sun, and dense forests in the collection of Jack London's tales of the far north that I had brought with me for such a circumstance. It was an inspired choice, the perfect literary escape into a world filled with igloos, ice fields, and numbing cold. But sadly it came to an end, so I reread it and reread it again. There was one other diversion. Pedro had killed a jaguar shortly before he left. The jaguar had a young cub that was now in a cage in the house. It was appealingly cute and kittenish and wanted interaction. On one occasion, I had it come out of the cage and was playing with it on the floor until its play became too rough for me. I wanted it to stop, but my attempts to push the cub away and calm it down stimulated the wild animal circuit in its brain. Suddenly, it was no cute kitten but a vicious hellcat. The Indian girl came at it with a broom, and together we managed to get it back in its cage. I came away with nasty scratches and 2 good bites on my arm. After one afternoon, Pedro appeared and greeted me matter-of-factly. He was a vigorous, solemn man in his early 40s. I liked him at once, but he told me soon into our conversation that there would not be any point in my staying, because he had stopped practicing his profession. Instead of working as a healer, he had become a political activist and was trying to organize his fellow Kofan to fight a great fight to their threat of their way of life, the presence in their forests of La Tejas. This was local Spanish name for Texaco, which had come to the northwest Amazon to export its rich reserves of oil. I had once stayed briefly in a frontier town that served as a Texaco's base, and was appalled by what I heard and saw. It was a center of noise, mud, fumes, thieves, whores, and roughnecks that were spreading devastation from its margins. But the town was hundreds of miles from this peaceful region, and I could not imagine how it impacted on Pedro's life. He told me that the noise of Texaco's helicopters had driven game from the forest, and that at the same time fish were disappearing from the rivers. Hunting and fishing had declined drastically in the past 2 years, which he blamed entirely on the oil explorations. All of his efforts were now going to collecting signatures on a petition demanding reparations from Texaco. He was sorry I had come such a long way for nothing. I was too. At least I now understood why Kofan men would not be hospitable to a gringo walking through the forest. The next morning I left. Eventually, I got back to my Land Rover and left Kofan territory for good. I was to spend another year wandering in Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru, but I never again made such an arduous journey in search of an exotic magical healer. Instead, I studied medicinal plants in Ecuador and Peru, learned about the cultivation and use of cocoa leaf, worked with a Colombian filmmaker to document the use of drug plants by shamans, and looked for unusual fruits, spices, and dyes. Although I did not admit it to myself consciously, on some level I realized that what I was searching for was not to be found in the wilds of the Amazonia or any other exotic location. I remained as committed as ever to finding answers to my questions. What is the source of healing? And what is this relationship between treatments and cures? How can doctors and patients access healing more of the time? What my search for Pedro taught me was that I was looking for answers in the wrong way, that I did not have to turn from my own land and culture, my formal education, and my own self to find the source of healing. But I did have to spend those years wandering in order to figure that out. Almost a quarter of a century has passed since I left Pedro's hut at the junction of two rivers. In that time, the destruction of the rainforest caused by the removal of oil has reached levels that Pedro and his people could never have imagined. Road building, oil spills, and the dumping of toxic chemicals into rivers, and a cynical disregard for native cultures by both national governments and foreign businesses have damaged vast areas of Colombia and Ecuador irreparably. Simply put, the Copan people have been put out of business. They are finished, terminated, and any knowledge held by their wise elders and traditional healers is soon to be lost forever. Other tribes now face the same threat. Whether they can avoid the fate of the Copan is uncertain. The years have been much kinder to me. I found out what I was looking for, and more. Found it much closer to home, in ways both unexpected and satisfying.
The Faces of Healing, Kristen. Kristen Killips should not be alive today. Certainly she should not have children. Not only did her doctors send her home to die, they were quite clear that the treatment she received had destroyed her reproductive capacity. Kristen's story begins with the appearance of unexplainable bruises on her body in 1974. She was 19 and living with friends on the island of Maui in Hawaii. A doctor suggested that she take iron supplements, but after 2 weeks without improvement, she underwent blood tests that yielded alarming results. All her blood counts were very low: red cells, white cells, and platelets. Platelets are the elements in blood responsible for clotting, and their low level was the cause of the bruising that attracted Kristen's attention. She was scheduled for bone marrow biopsy to determine why she lacked blood cells, and this result was even more ominous. Her marrow had almost no cells in it, only 2% of the normal number. The diagnosis was aplastic anemia, a medical calamity because it represents loss of the body's most vital tissues, the source of all the formed elements of the blood. Kristen was evacuated to a Southern California hospital for full-scale technological intervention in an attempt to save her life. The word aplastic means without form, a good description of a process that wipes out the normal components of bone marrow, leading to empty marrow syndrome, in which there are empty spaces in fat where blood-formed cells should be. Bone marrow produces the red cells that carry oxygen, the various white cells that are central to the body's defenses, and the platelets. Normally, there is continuous production of all of these elements, each one arising from its own ancestral cell line, maturing in stages, and finally migrating from the marrow cavity of large bones into the bloodstream. The ancestral cells themselves have a common ancestor called the stem cell, a primitive embryonic cell native to the marrow with the potential to differentiate into all other forms. Presumably, aplastic anemia results from failure of this stem cell as a result of injury or suppression of some kind. In Kristen's case, failure of bone marrow had no identifiable cause, but there was suspicion of a toxic exposure. 6 other people on Maui developed marrow and blood abnormalities at the same time. All of them were dead within 6 months. Such a cluster of cases suggests an environmental cause. Agricultural chemicals are used immoderately and carelessly in Hawaii, especially on the ubiquitous sugar, cane, and pineapple fields. Might these unfortunate people have had some genetic susceptibility to a pesticide or herbicide that entered their systems? We'll never know. Kristen arrived in Santa Barbara, California, desperately ill. Imagine the plight of someone who had almost no functioning blood marrow. Severe depletion of red cells can damp down metabolism and stress the heart, which has to work harder to compensate for the low oxygen content of the blood. Deficiency of white blood cells knocks out resistance to infection. The hospital had to keep Kristen in a protective reverse isolation environment to minimize her contact with germs, as well as maintain her on antibiotics and give her daily washes with disinfectants. Absence of platelets creates a risk of abnormal bleeding internally and externally. Treatment of aplastic anemia requires drastic measures. Doctors often give high doses of steroids and other immunosuppressive drugs, which work in some cases, but not others. Such treatment seems irrational, given the fact that the immune system is already crippled by the disappearance of many of its armies of white cells. But it is possible that some form of autoimmunity mediates the damage to the marrow, and steroids would suppress that. Maybe exposure to certain chemicals or viruses set off an autoimmune reaction in which the immune system attacks marrow stem cells. The reaction then becomes self-perpetuating, independent of the triggering event. Kristen's doctors began steroid treatment, but thought that she was too critically ill to survive. Instead, they sent her to UCLA Medical Center in Los Angeles for a bone marrow transplant. This operation may be the best hope for people with aplastic anemia, especially young people, who often respond well. But it is a major procedure with uncertain results, limited by the availability of a suitable donor, preferably an identical twin or a sibling who is antigenically compatible. Luckily, Kristen had both a brother and a sister who matched and were willing to donate marrow, but she wanted to avoid the ordeal of a transplant. I did many things to try to avoid it, she says, including visualizations, meditation on healing, and taking a lot of vitamins and supplements. Then I found a healer to work on me, but it was just too late. The doctors gave me a firm deadline, and the healer did not have enough time to help me. Kristen received 2 bone marrow transplants, but here she was not so lucky. Her body rejected both of them. That was the medical profession's best shot. There was nothing else to offer her but general support and comfort. Her doctors had no hope. Not so Kristen. She was determined to find other sorts of treatments, and her inclination was to experiment with psychic healing and visualization. The hospital psychologist had referred her to a researcher at UCLA who studied psychic healing. Through him, she found a healer who used hypnotherapy, as well as the laying on of hands. While she was still hospitalized, Kristen had 2 sessions a week with him for 2 weeks. At the end of that time, tests showed a modest increase in bone marrow, which her doctors told her she was unheard of. But although her blood counts rose dramatically, they did not get high enough for her to escape isolation rooms, and she required transfusions. Finally, the doctors said they could do nothing more. After discussions with the patient and her mother, they discharged her from the hospital. Her mother understood that her daughter was being released so that she could die at home. Kristen persevered in her search for healers. She saw another who came 5 days a week to do the laying on of hands. After 2 weeks, results were again miraculous. Blood counts rose and bordered on low normal. She hung on. Then she contracted serum hepatitis from the transfusions and became very ill, with a fever that remained over 100 degrees for a month. She heard of a woman who could prescribe healing diets by psychic intuition. The diet prescribed for her was not easy to follow. No sugars or starches of any kind, 2 eggs and an extra yolk each day with steamed vegetables, vegetable broth, and salad without oil, a little steamed fish or chicken, and 1 glass a day of pomegranate or grape juice, diluted 50% with water. Kristen followed this regimen for 9 months. It was the hardest thing I've ever done, she said. She lost weight, but it pulled me through. Within a few days, there was dramatic improvement in the symptoms of hepatitis. In all, Kristen spent half a year in the hospital. 1 year from the onset of her illness, she knew she was going to live. Although the road back to health remained slow and difficult. They told me I would never have children due to the drug they had given me to suppress rejection of the marrow transplants, she remembers. Because of the risk of uncontrollable bleeding, they couldn't let me have periods, so they also gave me a high dose of female hormones. In addition, I got prednisone to try to control reactions to the transfusions and male hormones to try to stimulate my bone marrow. I didn't have a period for a year, and one psychic healer who put their hand over my pelvis said she sensed total blackness there. But then I went on a fast for a week, and my period started. It's been completely regular ever since. 20 years later, Kristen is a healthy, vital woman and the mother of 4 natural, healthy children. Her recovery was so unusual from the medical point of view that one of her doctors presented her as a case at an international conference on aplastic anemia. Kristen writes, "I am not just alive, but quite healthy and strong. I've always thrived on physical activity and found as I got better that I could become as strong as I wanted to be. Daily cycling, regular running, and ocean swimming helped me to get over the final hurdle to excellent health. Today, I am healthy, happy, and busy raising my 4 children. I am a licensed naturopathic doctor, but I have not practiced since becoming a mother. I teach yoga, and I'm writing and illustrating a children's book. Our family is very active. We ski and windsurf, and I run regularly. Unless I mention my medical history, others do not suspect it. In fact, those who I do tell are quite surprised to learn that I was ever seriously ill." What reserves of healing power did Kristen draw on to reactivate her bone marrow, neutralize whatever was the original cause of the disease, and undo the toxic effects of invasive treatment? I am fascinated by her unwavering confidence through her ordeal. "I always believed there was a way to live," she told me. "I just had to find it in time." That belief and the search fueled my undying optimism and made me an active participant in the healing process. And what would she tell others facing grave medical crisis? "There may be different ways to healing for different people," she says, "but there's always a way. Keep searching." This concludes our first reading through Spontaneous Healing, Chapter 1, Prologue in the Rainforest. Please stay tuned for our next chapter, and we'll continue working through this. Thanks for joining me today. Peace.